Hello, and welcome everyone to today's Tech Talk on how to run shadow tests and acceptance tests in the pursuit of determining decision algorithm readiness for operational environments. My name is Haley. I'm part of the team here at NextMove, and I'll be supporting today's session along with a few others behind the scenes. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat or use the Q&A feature. As you're doing that, just be mindful of what you're sending to hosts and panelists and what you're sending to everyone, just so that your message gets to the right place. So with that, we've got two presenters today, Dirk and Tiff. I'm going to let them briefly introduce themselves and they'll get rolling from there. Dirk, take it away.
Yeah, good afternoon from Berlin. I'm Dirk. I work as a decision scientist at NextMove.
And hi, I'm Tiff. I'm a product manager at NextMove based in Brooklyn, New York at the moment. So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I'll just do a quick rundown of what we're going to cover today. So our focus will mostly be on acceptance and shadow testing. I'll do a quick overview of NextMove for folks that are new and how we're thinking about testing at NextMove. And as Haley mentioned, there'll be some time at the end for questions. So please do drop those in the chat as you have them and we will get to them. All right, so for anyone new, NextMove is a decision automation platform to build, test, deploy, and operate decision models. So we have a suite of developer tooling, which we won't be going into today. We've demoed it in previous talks, so I encourage you to check those out. Today, the focus will mainly be on the console user interface. This is where kind of all the testing magic happens. It's where collaboration around testing happens. But everything that we do show you today also has a CLI and API counterpoint, so you can do things programmatically as well. So there's a big universe of testing out there. These are some of the types of tests you may be familiar with. Today, we're going to show examples of batch experiments, acceptance testing, and shadow testing. And we'll also give you a preview. We'll just talk through some of the things that are coming next as well on this list. And so what we're trying to do is give shape to this universe. So we like to group things in this way. So thinking about things like shadow and switchback testing together as a group of production tests. You might call these online or real-time tests, but they have similar traits. And then in addition to that, there's historical testing. And so that's where we would bucket things like batch and acceptance and scenario tests. So these are things operating on previous runs, so historical data, hence the name. And then kind of underlying all of this are the components that we think are critical to letting us do this in a systematic and reproducible way. So those pieces include, for example, having run history saved and accessible to view and replay, having sets of named input files so that you can repeat tests and know that you're doing it on the same set of data, and a way to cut releases and collaborate on the same app versions across your team. So those are kind of the core pieces of how we think about testing. And so this is a lot going on in this slide, so I'll walk you through it. But overall, kind of what we're trying to convey is that testing is not a one-off thing. It's part of a whole workflow, and we'll talk through that workflow today. So this is kind of showing from bottom to top the sort of development to deployment stack. So you have your development, maybe in GitHub you're collaborating. Then you have the deployment environment. So this is our cloud, for example. And then you have the where the decisions are actually making impact. And so that's your trucks on the ground in this case. And then from left to right is sort of your level of confidence as you test and iterate on a given model. So if you go back to the bottom for that filled in circle, that is, in this case, our production model. So it's our baseline instance, maybe your main branch on GitHub. That's what's deployed in the cloud, and that's what's informing decisions on the ground. And then as you move to the right, these are candidate instances of your model. So maybe they're branches in GitHub. They could be, maybe you're testing out a new constraint, or you want to do a variation on your objective function. And so as you iterate on the model code, you would also do some testing. So maybe you would compare two different versions of the model with different objective functions, run some batch and acceptance tests. And then eventually, when you have enough confidence, you might merge them back. Or what is showing here is running your best candidate, so the one you have most confidence in, alongside your production instance in a shadow test. So that's something we'll cover today. So your production engine is still making decisions, but you've got that other model running on real-time data. And then to the right of that are just some examples of other tests. So switchback testing is the next picture. And then maybe you get to the point where you're happy and that new model gets shipped to production. But for today, our focus is really on these first two steps. And so we'll cover kind of the basics of batch and acceptance testing as well as shadow testing. So at NextMove, whenever we want to make something real, we like to put it in terms of the NextMove farm share company. And so I'm a product manager in the real world, but also a product manager at the NextMove farm share company. So our farm share has a fleet of vans. They pick up boxes from local farms and deliver them to customers' homes. In this particular case, we care about minimizing time on road and making sure as many orders as possible get delivered. So currently we have a model that we're happy with. It's running in production, and Dirk is working on a new version. And I'm going to hand it over to Dirk to show us how that's going.
All right. Let me share the screen here. So I'm also a decision scientist at the NextMove farm share business. And the setting is that currently we have a mixed fleet. Some vehicles support cold chain distribution, some not. So we need to make sure that goods that need to be cooled are only routed with appropriate vehicles. For that, we have a constraint in our next route model. It uses compatibility attributes to model that. But now we will upgrade all our fleet with vehicles that support cold chain distribution. So we don't need that constraint anymore. So I built a new version of that model that drops the constraint and also does some performance improvements. And we'll look at that today. So what you see here is the NextMove Cloud. We call that interface the console. We also have a CLI and an HTTP interface, but that's kind of the main web UI. We are in the farm share team. We have a number of apps. Each app solves, in this particular case, a specific optimization problem this company has. Today, we're interested in a pickup and delivery app to solve our routing needs. So let's click on that. Here you see some details that I was the last one that pushed a binary to that app. Before we look into experiments, I want to cover two important concepts. One is versions. A version is essentially a piece of code with an ID and a name. For this demo here, we have these two down here are relevant. This version here, this here runs in production. It has our compatibility attribute constraint enabled. And then this is the new version of the code where that constraint is disabled. And I also added some more performance improvements. The next concept are instances. You see a bunch of instances because it's also a shared space where team members can collaborate. But these two instances here are most important. An instant is a thing that answers your run request. So it uses a version to read in your input and produce some kind of output. So in this case, we have a production endpoint represented by this production instance and a staging instance that I can call separately. So the staging one has my new version with a disabled constraint. The production endpoint still has the one that's enabled. And now I want to convince TIFF that we should consider upgrading our algorithm. For that, I created a batch experiment. You can see that here. An acceptance test that uses a batch experiment. A batch experiment works on a single input set and tests your model in an offline way. So what that means is, in this particular case, I used an input set that has 12 inputs from Lancaster that we often use to verify our algorithms. And I executed that on the production instance and on the staging instance. And then the acceptance test view groups all the values together and presents that in a nice way, in particular in a way that it lists the metrics that TIFF is interested in and gives me a green or a green dot here or red cross if it's violet. So in this case, we're interested in the objective value, and that should decrease on average, and it did for the candidate model. The number of unplanned stops went down on average, which is also good. And the number of activated vehicles went up. So our fleet is utilized a bit more. This is also great. So you can click on that. You'll see that we ran the production instance with 12 runs. The same for staging. We get some summary statistics here. And we also get a nice scatter plot that shows it's like clearly better. You can also click or view the underlying batch experiment if you want to have even more information. Here we give you like all kinds of metrics. You can, as an algorithm developer, also communicate custom indicators to the experimentation system, like duration or other domain-specific values. And of course, you can also go extremely deep and look at the individual runs into a table. You can download that and then analyze them yourself to answer more questions. So let's go back to the acceptance test. Tiff, what do you think? Should we push that to production?
Well, it does look good. I'm happy that everything's passing. This model is really critical to our business, so I'd rather be safe. And maybe we should run a shadow test first, just to be extra cautious here.
It's a good idea because coincidentally, we shipped a feature just a few weeks ago that implements exactly that. So I'll show that here. So there's another little item called shadow test. Shadow test lets you kind of de-risk the deployment of your model by bringing your candidate instance like really close to the production instance. And the way it works is that a shadow test attaches to a baseline instance, for example, your production instance, and then every run that is sent to your production instance also gets a shadow to the candidate instance, in our case, the staging one. And then you can wait a little, observe the results, and look at these run pairs if anything is strange about them. So let's create one. Call it production versus staging. Already created a bunch of these, so I add a little suffix here. We'll take the production instance as our baseline instance, the staging instance as the candidate instance, and we'll let it run for 4 weeks. Obviously, we won't let it run for 4 weeks today, but we could. So the start one, this one is now started. So every run against the production endpoint should also produce a shadow run. So I prepared a little script to send 3 instances to production. Excuse me. So that is now underway. That kind of simulates the use of our production endpoint, maybe for daily planning purposes. And then the first thing you can do is you'll see you have a run history view where you see these 3 runs that are just made. But we can also click on the shadow test and we'll see some results already here. So I'll walk you through that. You'll get some metadata, the status is started. We can also complete or cancel a test at any time. And we can also peek at the results at any time. Now, of course, you have to do that responsibly to not end it early and trick yourself. But in this case, I think it was a good idea that we looked at it prematurely because there's some warning here, and that says some runs had missing values. And that's usually an indication that something went wrong. If we go to, for example, the value summary here, we see there are 3 runs for production, and they all went through. And then we have 3 runs for staging, as expected. But we only have 2 values for the objective function. That means something failed probably. So we'll toggle that in and scroll down to the run overview here. And here we'll see a failed run. So that's not good. Luckily, it was only on the shadow instance and not on the production one. Now you can click on these run IDs to take a look and get the details. Let's take a look at the failed one. Now here's an error message that says vehicle with ID vehicle-8 not found. And that's clearly my mistake. I probably produced a bug. But that's a new edge case, and we've never seen that before because I run my batch experiment. I also have some unit tests, and none of these picked it up. So that's maybe a good test case. So I could click also on the input here and copy that for like local debugging. And then before I continue, you can of course also view successful runs. This is, for example, one of these successful runs. And if you're interested in how these custom metrics come into the experimentation system, we have a little convention here as part of JSON where you can communicate custom key value pairs of numbers to the experimentation system. In this case, that's domain specific for the routing space, but of course it could be something different. Now, let's fast forward a bit. I fixed this error here. I pushed a new version. I called this version 2. Hopefully this time it's more robust and it works. Now, before I talk to Tiff, I would like to make sure we're not going to do this mistake twice. So I'll create a new input set that has this new failing instance in there. And we can use that new input set from now on. In order to do that, I can take the old Lancaster set with the 12 run IDs here. I'll create a new one. I'll call it Lancaster PA version 2. Paste in the old run IDs. Take the run ID that just failed. And if I could click create, I'll get an input set that has now 13 inputs. Now I've already done that. That's the one here. And we can use that for further testing. As I said before, I'll talk to Tiff about it. I created also a new instance that has my new, even more improved algorithm here with a bug fix. And I can use that for a small internal batch experimentation. What I did here, I executed a batch experiment with 2 instances, the staging one with the old algorithm and my new fixed one that fixed the bug on this 13 input set that I just created. And as we can see, it failed with the old one as expected, but the new one works fine. And that apart, the performance seems to be equal. And we can also scroll down, sort by input ID, and you can see, okay, I'm probably fixed the bug here. It looks good to me. Now, the next step, of course, is I'll just continue with the cycle. I run the same acceptance test that I showed initially on my new input set. Or before I do that, actually, I forgot one thing. I'll update my version here on the staging instance. So in order to change the underlying algorithms of an endpoint, you can just change the version of your binary. So in this case, that means the staging instance now answers all our run requests with my new improved version that hopefully fixes that bug.
And Dirk, maybe just quickly there, instances are super smooth and that was really easy to change. I think it's cool to point out that they give you that extra operational layer. So in this case, we're using it kind of as we move forward in a model. You could also use it as you roll back. So yeah, they come in really handy.
Yeah, the actual switch to production is then simply changing the version. And if something goes wrong, you can also roll back to a previous version. And these versions are immutable, so you can always go back in time if you want to. Now, this is the same acceptance test that we've seen before. It works on the improved input set. The metrics are still green, so that's good. But I think we should really do another shadow test before we push it to production, maybe for a few weeks, and then we're good. Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for walking through that. We covered a lot of ground there. So I will pull up some slides again and just so we can go through a little recap and a couple more things before we get to questions. All right. So what just happened? So it was really a whirlwind of testing and hopefully gave you a flavor for kind of how testing might fit into that whole development life cycle. So we started with an acceptance test. Dirk had a model that he was happy with. We agreed on metrics to check it against. Those all came back as green. We even dug into it in more detail, and all our input files in our input set came back as green as well. So from there, we wanted to be cautious, and so we moved to the online test. So that was the shadow test. And that gave us a chance to test it under real world production conditions. It was a good thing we did because we found that failed run. And so Dirk was able to investigate, fix it, push up a new version, attach that version to a new instance, and do some additional testing to make sure that that actually fixed our problem with that new input file that we found a failure on included in our input set. So that gives us yet another layer of confidence that we're moving in the right direction with our model. And we caught that edge case this time. And so from there, once we're happy with it, it gets promoted up to staging. And so now we start that cycle again. So we go back to that acceptance test. We're comparing prod versus staging, but staging now has that bug fix in the version. And then we would kick off another shadow test from there, and hopefully everything comes back looking good. And we might ship it to prod if we're happy with that. A couple other things I think came out of that is just the model management piece, just being able to really quickly update versions in your different instances. And then again, just the cycle that is testing. So it's really a continuous process, and hopefully this helped show that today. And so just going back to this slide on the different testing types. So we walked through batch, acceptance, and shadow today. And we've got some improvements to those in the works, but we're also working on switchback testing. So I thought maybe we could spend a little bit of time, Dirk, if you want to give a preview of what we're working on there.
Sure. So sometimes, the traditional way to test different things could be A/B tests, where you maybe route 50% of the traffic to one instance and 50% to the other instance. But especially in like routing use cases, for example, there's certain like network effects where the solution of one like solver run impacts kind of the future. And to obtain like independent groups is really difficult. So there's a method called switchback testing that essentially groups a specific time horizon into little time chunks, time units of like, for example, say 30 minutes. And we let the endpoint answer run requests for 30 minutes with the baseline model, and then for the next 30 minutes, maybe for the candidate model, and so on. And switchback testing has some like difficulties and interesting properties. There are definitely two components. One is kind of the data generating part, kind of the mechanics to switch between instances, given some kind of experimentation plan, and then also the analysis point of view, where there are many advanced statistical methods to look at these. So we'll be working on that probably in iterations, shipping kind of the data generating part first, and then improving on the analysis part in future iterations, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. Looking forward to it. All right. Before we move to questions, just a quick kind of summary. So hopefully we're all in agreement at this point that testing is really a critical step when you want to gain that confidence as you iterate on your models. We spent some time on acceptance testing and shadow testing. These are two of several great tools for increasing your confidence as you get closer to production. And just, yeah, reiterating again that testing is really a continuous process. So with that, I think now's a good time to service any questions. So I'm going to see what's come in and we will go from there. Cool. All right. So we have one. So yeah, Dirk, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you decide on exit criteria for a shadow test.
Yeah, that's a difficult topic for sure. I think it really depends on your kind of individual setting. Like, how many runs do you observe? Do you observe hundreds per day, or maybe do planning once a day? And then also on what kind of effects you want to detect. You want to see, like, look out for like catastrophic events, like these failure cases. Or do you also want to detect like little subtle changes in certain metrics? And the smaller the effect size, you want to detect, the probably larger runs you'll need. So it really depends. Currently, you need to decide that for yourself, but we hope we can build some tools that kind of automate that a bit and assist you.
Yep. Yeah, I imagine we were quite lucky here to observe that failure in just 3 runs, but in reality, you might have to run for quite a long time to see that.
Sure.
Yep. Cool. We've got another question here. So is it possible to automate this testing flow? And if so, how would you go about doing it?
Um, yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the features you saw in console are behind an HTTP API. So the web interface also uses that same HTTP API. So you can use that as well as part of continuous integration flows. For example, to kick off a batch experiment. For example, we do that often when we like develop a new version. We kick off a batch experiment internally to compare the kind of the old kind of next route version to the new one, and that gives us a little indication if something went wrong or there are any performance regressions.
Yeah, yeah, and things like GitHub Actions are really helpful in that case to
Yeah.
solidify that automation. Yep. All right, we've got another question. Oh, yep. So is there a way to sample the runs and not shadow every input in the set? I think the answer is not today, but it's definitely something we're considering if you want to expand on it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, for sure. Currently, we shadow every run, but in a setting where you have like hundreds of runs per hour, for example, that wouldn't be a great strategy. So, like some sampling strategy is definitely a good addition for the future. But for now, we would shadow every run.
Great. And we've just got one last question. When asked, how would you recommend getting started with testing? Like obviously Shadow is pretty far down the line. Where would you recommend starting?
Yeah, I mean, shadow testing requires kind of you have your production workload on the platform. You already have like a second version you want to test, but there are also like more easy ways to get started. For example, you just push your algorithm and then just send some runs manually and look at it manually. So that's also sometimes a good way of testing,
Yeah.
because humans are pretty smart to detect any problems in inputs. And then if you want to do that across a big input set, you can create your input set with many different inputs you want to like test and use for testing and do that. And then at some point, move your production endpoint to the system, and then features like online testing become more and more relevant.
Yep. Makes sense. All right, so I think that's all we have in terms of question time. Here's where to find us. I would encourage you to sign up for a free account and try it out, take it for a test run. We'd love to chat with you as well. We're always looking for feedback, especially as we develop out new testing types. So you're welcome to connect with our engineers. And then we have lots of content for you to dig into to learn more. So thank you everyone for joining today. Hope to see you next time.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if you ever want to talk switchback testing, let me know. I'm always there.